Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Welcome back to another episode of Messages of Necessity. My name is James, and I'm here once again to bring you some of the biggest stories the Empire Center has been following over the past few weeks. We officially have a state budget, and it's unbalanced. State expenses will outpace revenues by more than $20 billion over the next 3 years, drawing from the state's fund balance to cover at least part of those costs. Now, this sets the state up for a mismatch between revenues and expenditures in future years, and of course leaves the state with less to cover the budget gaps in the coming years in the event of an economic downturn. Both the average incomes and the net headcount of New Yorkers moving to other states hit an all-time high during the first full income tax filing period affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown, according to the most recent IRS data. The average adjusted gross income of New Yorkers moving to other states reached a new all-time high of over $130,000, and our net loss to other states came to 261,785 filers and dependents. Only California saw a larger loss during that same period. And finally, a little bit of information for all of you voters out there. New York school districts holding budget referendums next week plan to spend an average of $31,929 per student. Our annual school budget spotlight, which you can find on our website and linked in the show notes, details spending plans for 666 districts that will go before voters on May 16th. Now, 1/6 of those districts, about 111, plan to spend at least $40,000 per student, and 31 plan to spend at least $50,000. Now, despite receiving record-setting levels of state aid in the just enacted state budget, districts are poised to also increase property tax levies an average of 2%. That's all for the 3 big stories, but keep listening to this episode. We've got a few good interviews coming up, and I will be talking with Ken Girardin later at the end of the episode to talk a bit more about the budget process that just played out last week. Stay tuned.
All right, welcome back to Messages of Necessity. I'm here with Ken Moltner, who, among other things, is a practicing attorney, particularly with past experience in election law. Ken is also the author of Voter Access, Election Integrity, a chapter from the Empire Center's policy compendium, The Next to New York, which you can find at nextnewyork.net. Ken, so glad to have you on the show today. Thanks for making the time.
My pleasure, Tim. Thank you.
So we're going to be talking about elections today, an area that you have some experience in. So specifically, your chapter in The Next New York focuses on changes to absentee ballot rules. Give us a little bit on the status quo of what the status is in New York right now.
Sure. I'd like to just kind of put it in a general perspective for the audience first, if I may, and then address specifically the question about absentee balloting. A citizen's right to vote honestly is enshrined in our state constitution. It's Article 2 of Section 1. And in the November 2020 referendum, our citizens prioritized protecting the integrity of elections against voter fraud over the proposed constitutional amendments, including universal absentee balloting, that proponents said would have made it easier to vote. And polls have persistently reflected this priority. So our citizens' message is clear. The election law must balance the right to vote with procedurally open, fair, and efficient elections.
Well, let's stick here for a second. I was gonna go there in a minute, but as long as you brought it up. So okay. You're talking about the ballot initiatives from 2020, right?
Right. One of which was on absentee balloting, which was rejected by the voters. Universal absentee ballot voting. Yes.
Right. And what does that mean? Universal absentee ballot. That means you can get an absentee ballot without with no cost. What's the problem with that in your view?
The problem with that is that, first of all, we have already had laws that have addressed that. New York State Election Law 8400, which specifically delineates when a citizen may vote by absentee ballot, and it specifically delineates you're either not in the home county or there's an illness which will prevent one from going to the polls. So first, it goes against the grain of the election law. But secondly, there are no checks and balances. If one can just ask for an absentee ballot and get it, we can't ensure the integrity of the election or the integrity of that particular voter's vote. And indeed, the problem with what Governor Hochul did by signing legislation that was effective January 1, 2022, it amended the definition of illness in New York State Election Law 8400 to state that illness shall include, but not be limited to, instances where a voter is unable to appear personally at the polling place because there is a risk, emphasis added on the word risk, of contracting or spreading a disease. I'm adding emphasis on the word disease that may cause illness to the voter or other members of the public. Now, the difficulty with that is that the common cold is defined as a disease that may cause illness. And the mere risk of contracting the common cold under the amended definition of illness renders a voter unable to appear personally and thus entitled to an absentee ballot. So the difficulty here with that type of legislation is that, first of all, it went directly against the wishes of the voters. In those proposed amendments to the state constitution was specifically an amendment of voters. Do you want a no excuse absentee ballot? The voters said no. Yet 2 months later, Governor Hochul signs legislation that effectively just does that. It's going against the will of the people. There are no checks and balances, and it could affect election integrity.
So I guess if we're gonna mince our words here, it's technically not no excuse. It's literally giving them an excuse to require an absentee.
That's certainly.
It seems to go against what the people said back in November, and so maybe we don't draw the correlation that they wouldn't accept any excuse to allow absentee ballots. But it is to your point, I think there's a construction issue with this in terms of following the law of the Constitution, in terms of giving people access to absentee ballots, and then unilaterally making that change based on what looks kind of like a loophole, right? And so if you want to present those changes, if you wanted to go after it, going through the state constitution was the right move the first time. If you want to try that again, that avenue would still be open to Governor Hochul or to anybody else who wanted to do it. But it should be done properly. That's a rule of law question more than anything else, in my view.
Well, it's a rule of law question, but to me, it goes back also to the will of the voters. It went before the voters. The voters said no. Now, I hasten to add that the law as signed by Governor Hochul had a sunset provision of December 2022. But nevertheless, that does not mitigate the danger, in my view, because once again, either the legislature can pass it and Governor Hochul can sign it, or as Governor Cuomo did, if there is a emergency perceived or otherwise, then it could be done by executive fiat. So I don't believe that the danger is at all mitigated. These are the type of proposals, in my view, that are anathema to the will of the people and should be done, as you point out, properly. If it's going to be done, do it through the state constitution.
Yeah, and I think we're getting into two specific issues here. One is, again, the process, the rule of law, making sure we're following what the Constitution lays out. The second is actually debating the terms of how and if, to what extent you allow absentee balloting to take place. There's the current, there is the proposed and rejected, and then there is sort of where you think that maybe the governor or the legislature or whomever is pressing for changes to this want to land. And so that's a debate at the minimum that should be had and should be had publicly. And those any proposed changes should go to the people. The last time it did, they said, no, thank you.
Correct. I think that's right. And my view is that the legislature, in enacting the election law section 8400, created an appropriate balance. It said that you're not in your home county, or you're unable to personally appear at the polling place because of illness or physical disability. I think that is a balance, and if that balance is going to be changed, I agree with what you're saying in terms of the approach. That's how it should be done.
Sure. All right. And so absentee balloting is one issue that you talk about in the chapter. There are several others. And I think what we've already hit on a little bit is there are some problems with election access, ballot access. There are some issues that should be solved. I think everybody agrees that there are problems in the system. What there's not agreement on is what specifically those problems are, and maybe more importantly, what the solutions are. So you've outlined a handful of things that you think should be changed. Do you want to just quickly go over those and we can dive in as appropriate?
Sure. So in addition to strengthening the existing absentee balloting restrictions that we've discussed, ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is another issue, and as we point out in the chapter, in 2020, the general election campaign, there were instances by both parties to exploit the ambiguity created by the current law in terms of ballot harvesting.
Tell us what ballot harvesting is for anybody who may not know.
Ballot harvesting is basically other people obtaining a signed absentee ballot and bringing it to the election, the Board of Elections in the appropriate county, and providing those ballots. So it is an offshoot of absentee voting, because obviously the voter is not going into the booth, but the voter is having his or her ballot taken by somebody else to the Board of Elections. And again, it's a matter of checks and balances. There is very little, if any way, to ensure the integrity of a person's ballot if person A is handing it to person B, or there are a number of ballots being handed to person B to bring that. Again, it goes back to the fundamental issue of election integrity. And there have been a number of instances of claims of potential fraud in terms of ballot harvesting. And the question arises, why is that necessary? Why is it even necessary to harvest ballots? There are so many ways that people are able to vote that I think there's a serious question of the necessity for it to be done. But at least if it's going to continue, there has to be serious penalties for violation. There have to be consequences for it.
Yeah, and I think I was reading your chapter again this morning, and I was thinking about some of these issues. It seems almost unbelievable that there's not a better system for tracking this through technology. And this is sort of anecdotal on my end, and I'm putting you on the spot. We didn't rehearse this at all, but doesn't it seem a little crazy that, given the state of technology, what you can do with databases, the prevalence of technology. I mean, we hold really great processing computers in our hands all day long, and we can't figure out a way through the election process to verify identities in real time, whatever the course may be. And this gets to another point you brought up, which is proof of ID. But to know whether a ballot has been cast, to know whether a ballot being cast is somebody who is deceased, that doesn't seem, in the grand scheme of things, to be that difficult. What is? I mean, is there a barrier there? What is it?
Yeah, it's a good point. And to go to point, and I'm going to mention something that's not in the chapter, and that's election law section 8408, effective April 1, 2022, which is online absentee ballot registration, which to me actually just exacerbates the type of problem that you're talking about. And that election law section, which is entitled Electronic Absentee Ballot Application Transmission System, provides in part, the State Board of Elections shall establish and maintain an electronic absentee ballot application transmittal system through which voters may apply for an absentee ballot online. And the alarm's already been sounded there. There was already a published article in a newspaper about how somebody had ordered celebrity ballots under the name of celebrities, and that's in a published article in newspapers. So, to your point, while there is now the potential for online absentee balloting, and to your point about the technology, there is also the potential for abuse. With all the hacking, with all the potential problems that we have through electronic transmissions, this just exacerbates it. And also, when you don't have the in-person voting, and that's exactly another argument for in-person voting, you have the potential for fraud and not ensuring the integrity of an election.
All right, so we went through ballot harvesting. We've talked about absentee ballots at great length at this point.
Yeah.
Briefly mentioned proof of ID. There's a handful of other things you've included in your chapter that you'd like to see change. Early voting, sort of related, right? Giving people the access to get in.
Early voting. I like to see that changed. I understand the salutary purpose behind it, but why 9 days? And in fact, studies have indicated that it has not increased voter participation. There are also issues with those 9 days. A number of elections, especially special elections, are held during the school year. So schools now, public schools, are affected by that. And it seems to me that to make more sense, that what you do is you scale back that 9-day period, and you scale it back to 2 days. Maybe there's the Friday before the election and a Saturday, so you have a weekend day for those people who work and can't vote during the week. Have the Saturday, and then you have your election on a Tuesday.
So some but less.
Some but less. Correct. Some but less. And there's also a tremendous cost to it. There's a cost-benefit analysis that has to be weighed. Of course, the idea is to have people to vote. We're a democracy. We want people to vote, but we want to do it in a way that ensures, as I said, integrity, and we want to do it in a way that's also cost efficient. And 9 days does not promote either of those salutary goals.
Yeah, well, and I think maybe that's a good point for us to leave it, is finding the balance between having fair, properly executed elections and making sure that the voters have access, can and want to participate in them, which is the overall goal, I think, of everybody. Ken, there's a lot more in your chapter. Again, we can find it at nextnewyork.net. Thank you for making the time. Thanks for having this conversation. This is an issue that's going to continue to come up, I think, over the course of the year, certainly every 2 years and every 4 years, more so than in other years. But we'll keep our eye on it, and maybe we'll get to talk about it again.
I hope so. Thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate it.
Welcome back to the final segment of Messages of Necessity. Once again, my name is James, and I'm here with Ken Girardin, a fellow at the Empire Center. You know him well from this show. And today we're talking about the budget. As you know, the budget finally passed last week. And if you've been following the Empire Center blog, you know it's remarkably big and it's remarkably unsustainable. But it was also remarkably late. And at the same time, it was rushed through with what's called a message of necessity. And to recap for new viewers, what our show namesake is in terms of Albany and rulemaking and jargon, a message of necessity allows the governor to waive the constitutional requirement for bills to age on a lawmaker's desk for 3 days before it is voted on. So that's bad. It's always bad. But Ken, welcome to the show. And please, why was it especially bad here?
It was especially bad to see the legislature waive the 3-day waiting period, in part because the size of what they were voting on, it was a $230 billion spending plan, and the fact that it was unnecessary to waive that waiting period. People might remember on the Thursday before lawmakers started voting, the governor announced the framework for this deal, or was it the conceptual deal that had been reached, which meant it was at the point where you could start printing bills and letting the public see what was going to be voted on. Instead, that didn't happen. And details didn't start to come out until the day that lawmakers were voting on these. And that meant not only could the public not see what their lawmakers were voting on, but the lawmakers themselves couldn't really make informed decisions about what was coming in front of them. There are details in this budget that we're just now getting our arms around. For instance, the fact that Medicaid, the massive healthcare program that eats up about a quarter of state taxes, is going to grow 13 or 14% next year based on new calculations from Bill Hammond. These weren't calculations that were on lawmakers' desks. This was stuff that Bill Hammond found out after the fact. So these are the sorts of things that might have come out if we'd waited the required 3 days. But the legislature didn't. Instead, they rushed stuff. And like I said, it was completely unnecessary because the details were ostensibly finalized 5 days before they started voting.
Ken, I agree with you that these messages of necessity are unnecessary, and yet they've become increasingly common in the budget process in Albany. I think it was 8 out of the last 10 budget cycles have used a message of necessity. Has Albany gotten too used to this? Is it now an integral part of the budget process?
I'd say first, the public has gotten too used to it, and they've gotten conditioned to the legislature making major decisions behind closed doors. Fun fact about messages of necessity, people often frame it as the governor using it as a tool to ram things on the legislature and rush things. The reality is messages of necessity only come at the request of both legislative leaders. So it's tempting to frame this as a problem with Governor Hochul, but the reality is it's the members of the Senate and the members of the Assembly choosing to do business this way.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Is this almost like an unspoken deal to get? Because a lot of the times when you're passing a budget through and you're rushing it through, there's a greater chance of bad policy or policy that lawmakers might not want to see debated, making it through and sneaking under the radar. Is that part of the negotiation here, or the unspoken deal?
Part of the allure?
Yes. Yeah, right.
It's absolutely part of the allure. The budget is a place where you can cram through unrelated policy and have it tucked in. And basically, worst case scenario, it's going to be a news story for a couple days after the budget is adopted.
Right. So then it's really become a tool not to rush through a budget, but to almost get your laundry list of wants rushed through and nobody notices. So how can we increase the transparency in the budget process?
The first step is for the public to understand where things have gone wrong. With messages of necessity, again, that's not Governor Hochul waving a wand and moving things in this opaque process. That's the legislative leaders in the Senate and the Assembly requesting messages of necessity, and then the rank and file members of the Assembly and the Senate voting to accept that message of necessity. So this is something where our state lawmakers can do a better job themselves personally saying what they will and will not accept for the budget process and saying it at the onset. And they should be asked point blank, why are you doing this? Why are you deliberately making the budget process more opaque? Not just because the state constitution says we should do otherwise, but because common sense says we should be doing otherwise. The practices in other states indicate we should be doing otherwise.
As always, good advice, Ken. I think we'll leave it there for this episode. Hopefully Albany pays attention for the next budget cycle. To all our viewers, thank you so much for listening again to this episode of Messages of Necessity. Be sure to subscribe and review the show and keep it right here. Make sure you keep tuned to our blog. The show notes will have all the links of everything we talked about today. And until next time, take it easy. For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.